Have you ever silenced a part of yourself to make someone else comfortable? For years, I did just that, until my husband's cruelty on my birthday became my breaking point. This isn't just a story about a bad marriage, it's about reclaiming your voice. My name is Ellen, and on the evening of my 35th birthday, my world didn't end with a bang, but with a quiet, venomous whisper. It happened at the Palmetto Club, the kind of exclusive Charleston establishment where 100-year-old family names are spoken with more reverence than prayers. My husband, Walter Sterling, a man whose lineage was as polished as the silverware in front of us, called me a disgrace. He didn't shout. He let the words slide out like ice, chilling the warm southern air between us. My crime, in front of 20 of the city's most influential figures, was admitting my grandfather was a union carpenter. I had looked out the grand, floor-to-ceiling window and pointed to the distant, glittering lights of the Ravenel Bridge, saying with pride that my grandfather's hands had helped build it. Walter's smile tightened. He turned to our guests and announced that some things, no matter how much you spend on them, could never truly be refined. Then, he and his friends stood as one and walked out, leaving me in a sea of silent judgment. A moment later, the maître placed a leather-bound bill in front of me. $5,128. Staring at that impossible number, I didn't feel shame. I felt a strange, cold clarity. Walter thought he had shattered me into a million pieces. He had no idea that in the ruins, he had just forged a weapon. Before I tell you how that single piece of paper became my Declaration of Independence, if you believe that a person's worth is more than their bank account, hit that subscribe button, because you'll want to see how this story ends. But that cold, cruel man in the Palmetto Club wasn't the man I fell in love with. Or perhaps he was, and I was just too enchanted by the fairy tale to see the monster lurking beneath. Our story began 4 years ago, a picture-perfect Charleston romance. I was a high school history teacher, my world measured in semester plans and the quiet satisfaction of seeing a student's eyes light up with understanding. My life wasn't glamorous. It was built on a foundation of dusty textbooks, field trips to Fort Sumter, and a salary that was rich in purpose but poor in every other sense. I met Walter Sterling at a fundraising gala for the City Museum. He was a living landmark, a scion of the Sterling family whose name was etched onto hospital wings and university libraries. He moved through the glittering crowd with an easy confidence, while I was busy making sure the student history exhibit I'd set up didn't get knocked over. He approached me not to talk about the markets, but about a little-known Civil War battle I'd featured. He listened, truly listened, as I talked. He told me he was exhausted by the debutantes and heiresses he was expected to court. He called me refreshingly authentic, a breath of fresh air in his gilded cage. On our first few dates, he seemed utterly charmed by my simple life. He said, "You remind me of what's real, Ellen. You're not trying to be anyone else." I fell for it all, the charm, the attention, the intoxicating idea that our two worlds could collide and create something beautiful. I truly believed our love could build a bridge between his life on South of Broad and mine in the real world. But bridges have tolls. And the price for crossing into Walter Sterling's world, I soon discovered, was to be paid in pieces of myself. The very authenticity he claimed to cherish quickly became a project he needed to refine. It began with my clothes. The comfortable J.Crew dresses I wore to parent-teacher conferences were gently nudged to the back of our sprawling walk-in closet. In their place appeared sleek, architectural dresses from designers whose names I couldn't pronounce. "I just want you to feel confident when we're with my partners, darling," he'd murmur, his hands adjusting a heavy necklace on my throat until it felt less like jewelry and more like a beautiful leash. After he'd curated my appearance, he started on my voice. My slight southern drawl, which he once called charming, was now something to be smoothed over. "It's whom, not who, in that case," he'd correct softly in the car on the way to a charity ball. He called them our little lessons, but it felt like I was being graded. Soon, my stories were censored too. The anecdotes about my students, the ones that once made him laugh, were now met with a tight smile. At dinner parties, if I began to talk about a breakthrough with a student, he would interject with an indulgent chuckle, "Ellen has such a big heart for her work, before seamlessly redirecting the conversation to the stock market or their upcoming trip to Europe. I began to edit myself in real time, filtering my thoughts, sanding down my own personality to avoid his gentle corrections. The breath of fresh air he'd fallen in love with was being taught to hold her breath. I was so busy performing the role of Mrs. Walter Sterling that I didn't notice the woman in the mirror becoming a complete stranger. But my best friend, Bonnie, she noticed. Bonnie and I had taught in adjacent classrooms for years. Our friendship was built in the trenches of parent-teacher conferences and funded by cheap coffee. During one of our rare get-togethers, she looked at me across the worn wooden table of our favorite diner, a place Walter would have called unbelievably provincial. And she didn't mince words. "Where have you gone, Ellen?" she asked quietly. "You've been talking for an hour, and I haven't heard a single thing about what you think, what you feel. It's all Walter says this, and Walter prefers that." "What does Ellen prefer?" A wave of defensiveness washed over me, hot and immediate. "You just don't get it, Bonnie," I snapped. "It's a different league. The stakes are higher. He's not trying to change me, he's trying to help me survive in a world that would eat someone like me for breakfast." Her expression was a mixture of pity and frustration. "The Ellen I know is the one who does the eating. She wouldn't be afraid of anyone. She'd be too busy teaching them something." I tried to laugh it off, explaining that all relationships require adjustment and compromise. But even as I spoke the words, they felt hollow and rehearsed. I was defending my own erasure. I was so desperate to believe I was living a fairy tale that I ignored the fact that the story was no longer about me. I pushed Bonnie away because she was holding up a mirror, and I couldn't stand the reflection of the ghost I was becoming. Pushing Bonnie away was a profound, strategic mistake because it left me utterly alone on Walter's island. And once I was isolated, he targeted the last piece of my independence I had left. A year into our marriage, my grandfather, the union carpenter, the man whose integrity I so admired, passed away. He left me his life savings, $75,000, earned over 40 years of sweat and dedication. To me, that money wasn't a windfall, it was a sacred trust. It was the smell of sawdust, the feel of his calloused hands, the physical manifestation of a life of hard work. I told Walter I wanted to use it to create a scholarship fund for students at my old school. He smiled, the same indulgent smile he used at his dinner parties, and sat me down in his home office. He pulled up graphs and charts filled with acronyms I didn't recognize. He spoke of a ground floor opportunity in a disruptive biotech startup his firm was vetting. He made it sound like he was letting me in on a secret, a privilege. "Ellen, your grandfather was a builder," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Let's honor him by building this into real wealth, something that will secure our future." I felt naive and unsophisticated questioning him. So, I signed the paperwork. 6 months later, he broke the news over a glass of expensive wine. He feigned devastation. "The clinical trials didn't pan out, darling. The company folded. It's all gone." There was no apology. It was presented as a shared tragedy. But all I felt was a cold, sickening shame. I hadn't just lost money, I had lost my grandfather's legacy. And in its place was a new, heavy sense of obligation to Walter, the man who had gambled away my past. Losing my inheritance chained me to Walter with a guilt he had expertly crafted. I became a ghost in my own life, my only goal to be flawless enough to finally earn his approval. I convinced myself it was working. For my 35th birthday, he promised me a quiet dinner, a return to how things used to be. Just the two of us. The hope I felt that day was a fragile, desperate thing. Then the texts began. First, it was one other couple, a client too important to refuse. Then another. By the time I arrived at the Palmetto Club, my romantic dinner for two had morphed into a power dinner for 20. I spent the evening playing the part of the adoring wife, smiling until my face felt like a cheap plastic mask. Near the end of the meal, Mr. Beaumont, the elderly patriarch of a Charleston dynasty and Walter's main target, turned to me. "Walter tells me you are a teacher, my dear. Tell me about your family." For the first time all night, I felt a spark of my old self. "Oh, my grandfather was a builder," I said, my voice filled with a pride I hadn't felt in years. A union carpenter. His crew was one of the teams that built the Ravenel Bridge. A sudden, awkward silence fell over the table. Walter set his crystal glass down with a soft, deliberate click. What a quaint story, he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. He looked at me, and the mask of the charming husband fell away completely. His voice was low, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. Darling, a word of advice. People in this room don't discuss manual labor over their dinner. It's unseemly. After all the effort I've put into refining you, for you to bring that up here, now. It's an absolute disgrace. The word disgrace hung in the air, so heavy it seemed to dim the crystal chandeliers. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the city. 20 of Charleston's most powerful people suddenly became intensely interested in the contents of their wine glasses, their gazes averted, their silence, a form of silent agreement with my executioner. Walter didn't look at me again. He simply tossed his linen napkin onto the table, a final, contemptuous gesture, and led his followers out of the room. They filed past my chair without a word, as if leaving the scene of a distasteful accident. I was left completely alone in the opulent silence, a ghost at a feast. The maitre d', a kind-looking man in his late 50s, finally approached the table, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the empty room. He placed the heavy, leather-bound billfold in front of me with a look of quiet apology. I opened it. The total at the bottom seemed to mock me. $5,128. I stared at the number, and a strange thing happened. The burning tears I'd been holding back simply evaporated. The hot, chaotic shame in my chest cooled and hardened into something solid, something like steel. It was a moment of absolute, piercing clarity. This bill wasn't a debt, it was an invoice. It was a detailed accounting of my silence, my compliance, my erasure. Walter hadn't just abandoned me with a check, he had finally shown me the price tag he had placed on my soul. And in that silent, gilded room, I decided I was no longer for sale. We all have a moment that defines our lives, splitting it into a before and an after. Tell me in the comments about a moment that gave you clarity. My after was just beginning. So what is the first move you make when your carefully constructed life has been publicly demolished? The old Ellen would have called her best friend, Bonnie, weeping and defeated. She would have sought comfort. But the woman Walter left behind in that restaurant wasn't the old Ellen. My first phone call wasn't for a shoulder to cry on, it was for a sword. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over Bonnie's name for just a second, before continuing down to a name I hadn't dialed in years. Irene. Irene was a brilliant attorney I'd befriended while volunteering for a legal aid society back when I was still teaching. She was sharp, pragmatic, and possessed a quiet intensity that I had always admired. She answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp as a legal document. Irene, it's Ellen, I said, and the steadiness of my own voice surprised me. My marriage is over. It just ended very publicly at the Palmetto Club, and my husband left me with the bill. I'm not calling for advice on how to feel. I'm calling for instructions on what to do. Right now. There was a brief pause, and then her voice shifted from friendly to focused. Okay, Ellen. I hear you. First things first. Do you have a credit card with both of your names on it? Yes, I said. Perfect, she replied. You're going to walk up to the maitre d', and you are going to pay that entire bill with that card. Get an itemized receipt. Every overpriced bottle of wine he ordered to impress his friends is now evidence. Then, you are going to go home. Do not speak to him. We will talk at 8 a.m. Sharp. I hung up the phone. The humiliation was still there, but it wasn't a weight anymore. It was fuel. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a client with a case to build. Following Irene's instructions was like following a map out of a maze I didn't even know I was in. I walked from the private dining room to the front reception desk, my heels clicking purposefully on the marble floor. The maitre d', a distinguished gentleman named Antonio, rushed over, his face etched with concern. Mrs. Sterling, I am so sorry for the commotion. It's Ellen, I corrected him gently. and the commotion is over. I placed the joint account American Express card, the black card Walter insisted I carry for major emergencies, on the counter. The irony was not lost on me. "I'll be settling the bill," I said. "And I will need a complete, itemized copy of the receipt, please." As he processed the payment, I looked at the list of charges he printed for me. It was a catalog of Walter's arrogance: 3 bottles of Dom Perignon, a round of Macallan 25 for the table, seafood towers I hadn't even tasted. I folded the receipt carefully. This wasn't a bill, it was Exhibit A. Then, I leaned in, allowing a slight tremor into my voice, playing the part of a distraught wife. "Antonio, I have a rather delicate question. My husband was not himself tonight. I'm worried about what his partners might think. Are the cameras in that room operational? I might need to review the footage just to see the full context of the disagreement for legal and insurance reasons." Antonio's professional mask softened into a look of genuine empathy. He understood perfectly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "For the security of our guests, all our cameras are always recording. As a matter of policy, we retain all footage for 90 days. If a subpoena were to arrive, we would, of course, comply." I nodded, a silent thank you passing between us. I walked out into the humid Charleston night, the receipts in my purse feeling less like paper and more like stone tablets. I had my evidence. The game had just begun. I found refuge that first night on Bonnie's worn, comfortable sofa, and for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming. The next morning, the expected digital storm hit. My phone lit up with a textbook progression of narcissistic panic from Walter. First came the rage-filled texts. "How dare you embarrass me like this?" Then, the pathetic pleas, "Please come home. The house is so empty." I read them all with a detached sense of observation and deleted them one by one. But Walter's real move wasn't private, it was a public spectacle of manipulation. Around mid-morning, my phone rang. It was Mark, my former principal, a man I respected immensely. "Ellen?" He sounded confused. "Are you okay? A delivery truck just dropped off an arrangement of white orchids here at the school that's bigger than my desk. The card is. Well, it's addressed to you, but it seems written for an audience." My blood ran cold. "What does it say, Mark?" He cleared his throat and read. "To the wonderful faculty who know my Ellen's heart, please tell her I am devastated by my actions. I pray she can forgive a foolish man who loves her more than words can say. Please, encourage her to come home. W." I felt a nauseating wave of disgust. This wasn't an apology, it was a performance. He hadn't sent the flowers to me, he'd sent them to my professional reputation. He was preemptively poisoning the well, casting himself as the repentant husband and me as the cruel, irrational wife. He wasn't trying to win me back, he was trying to win. That ostentatious, hollow gesture was the final piece of evidence I needed. It proved he would never see me as a partner, only as an audience to be managed. That grotesque floral arrangement was the last push I needed. His attempt to control the narrative had backfired. It gave me the angry, focused energy to do what had to be done. Irene had been clear. The restaurant incident was powerful, but proof of financial abuse would be the kill shot. So that night, I went back. I knew Walter would be chairing a philanthropic gala until at least midnight, a performance he would never cut short. Bonnie dropped me off a block away. Our getaway driver in a beat-up Honda, a quiet promise that I wasn't alone in this. Letting myself into the sprawling, silent house felt like a burglary of my own life. The air was cold and sterile, the scent of lemon polish and Walter's cologne hanging in the air. This wasn't a home, it was a showroom. I moved quickly, my sneakers silent on the imported marble floors. First, I went to our bedroom and gathered the things that were truly mine. My grandmother's simple gold locket, a box of faded family photographs, my teaching degree. Then, the main event. His office. My heart hammered against my ribs, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall sounding like a bomb. With trembling hands, I opened the bottom drawer of his desk, where he kept his private investment files. I started photographing everything with my phone. And then, my breath caught in my throat. I saw a thin file labeled ES Legacy. My initials. Inside, I didn't find stock certificates for a biotech firm. I found incorporation papers for a Shell LLC and bank statements detailing a single transaction. The wire transfer of my $75,000 into its account followed a week later by a transfer of the exact same amount into Walter's personal brokerage account. It wasn't a bad investment. It was grand larceny disguised as a loving gesture. I photographed every page, put the file back exactly where I found it, and walked out without a backward glance. Armed with a digital folder full of Walter's crimes, I was no longer the frightened woman from the restaurant. When his lawyer called for a mediation, I felt no fear, only a cold, hard resolve. We met in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper, the kind of place designed to make people feel small. Walter was already there, flanked by his shark of a lawyer. He'd artfully skipped a shave, a pathetic attempt to look distraught. His lawyer began with a patronizing speech about amicable resolutions before making a frankly insulting offer. A small lump sum in exchange for my signature on a permanent non-disclosure agreement. He was offering to buy my silence. I didn't say a word, I just looked at Irene. Irene gave a thin, dangerous smile. "Thank you for the offer," she said, her voice cutting through the pretense. "But we're not here to negotiate a gag order. We're here to discuss a crime." She slid a thin file across the polished table. "This contains the bank records for a shell company named ES Legacy. It shows my client's inheritance of $75,000 being deposited and then wired to Mr. Sterling's personal account 1 week later. We believe the SEC has a name for that. Securities fraud." Walter shot to his feet. "She stole those documents. This is illegal." Irene didn't flinch. "And then," she continued, placing her phone on the table, "there's the footage from the Palmetto Club. The audio is crystal clear. I wonder what your investors, particularly Mr. Beaumont, would think if they heard you call your wife a disgrace for being proud of her working-class grandfather." The blood drained from Walter's face. He looked at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. The charming, powerful man was gone. In his place sat a small, trapped coward. Checkmate. The settlement was finalized a week later. I didn't gloat or celebrate. Walking out of that law firm for the last time, I felt no elation, only a profound, quiet relief. The war was over. My inheritance was returned, with punitive interest, and the financial agreement was enough for me to start over, completely on my own terms. My first act of rebellion against Walter's world of cold, cavernous spaces was to buy a small, sun-drenched condo in a neighborhood with big oak trees and noisy children. My second act was to call my old principal. By a stroke of luck, a history teacher had just gone on maternity leave. Walking back into a classroom, with its familiar scent of chalk dust and old paper, felt like coming home. The daily chaos of teaching teenagers about the American Revolution grounded me, reminded me of the woman I was before I became a project to be polished. But I knew my journey wasn't complete. The lessons I had learned had been too painful to keep to myself. So, I bought a decent microphone, soundproofed my spare bedroom with blankets, and I began to speak. I launched an anonymous podcast called The Teacher's Ledger. Each week, I'd take one of Walter's manipulations, the financial control, the social isolation, the subtle criticisms, and I would dissect it, not as a bitter ex-wife, but as a teacher explaining a concept. I thought maybe a few people would listen. Instead, a community was born. The emails poured in, women sharing stories of their own gilded cages. "I didn't know love bombing was a term until I heard your podcast," one listener wrote. I had reclaimed my own voice, and in doing so, I had accidentally created a chorus. And that's the real power of sharing our truth, isn't it? If this story is resonating with you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to feel less alone. I built my new life methodically, like the historian I was, piecing together a future from the artifacts of my past. My students, my cozy condo, my podcast community, these were the pillars of my new world. A year passed. On the exact anniversary of that night at the Palmetto Club, I was sitting in my favorite armchair, grading papers, a cup of tea steaming beside me. The memory of that dinner was no longer a wound. It was a scar, a reminder of a battle I had survived. Then, an email notification popped up. The sender's name was Eleanor Beaumont. The name hit me like a jolt of electricity. She was the wife of Walter's most important potential client, a quiet, elegant woman who had sat across from me at that very table. My hand trembled as I opened the message. She wrote that she had stumbled upon the teacher's ledger months ago and had become a devoted listener, never knowing who was behind the microphone. It was only when she heard my latest episode, where I talked about the anniversary of my moment of awakening, that the pieces clicked. The restaurant, the city, the story of a husband's public shaming. She knew it was me. Ellen, she wrote, I'm writing to you today to say thank you. For 30 years, I have been a silent partner in my own life, enduring 1,000 tiny cuts of condescension and control. But watching you that night, watching you absorb that horrific insult with a dignity that was almost regal, it changed me. You didn't scream or cry. You simply stood. That quiet act of strength forced me to finally look at my own gilded cage. I filed for divorce 2 months ago. You weren't the disgrace in that room, Ellen. For me, you were the revolution. The tears I didn't shed that night came flooding out now, not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming connection. My deepest humiliation had been someone else's liberation. Eleanor's email wasn't just a validation, it was a recontextualization of my entire story. I had spent a year framing my journey as one of personal survival, a story about escaping a gilded cage and learning how to fly on my own. Her words revealed a more profound truth. The single most painful moment of my existence, the second Walter's voice sliced through that room and branded me a disgrace, was not just an ending. It was a beginning. For a full year, I had seen it as the lowest point, the absolute nadir of my worth. But it was also a seed. In his attempt to publicly break me, Walter had inadvertently demonstrated what an unbreakable spirit looked like. His cruelty was the catalyst, but my quiet refusal to crumble was the message. It was a lesson in the strange, powerful alchemy of pain. It taught me that we are never suffering in isolation. In our moments of greatest trial, when we feel the most invisible and alone, someone is always watching. Someone is seeing us endure our struggle, and they are borrowing our strength. I thought I was just a humiliated wife in a restaurant. But to Eleanor, I was a quiet demonstration of resilience. She didn't see a disgrace, she saw a blueprint for her own escape. And that is the story's final, beautiful irony. Walter, a man obsessed with controlling narratives, had authored his own defeat. He had intended to make an example of my weakness, but instead, he had revealed a strength I didn't even know I possessed, a strength that was powerful enough to set another woman free. My pain had been redeemed. It had found a purpose beyond myself. So what is the final lesson learned from a $5,000 dinner and a broken heart? It's this. Sometimes, your life has to be completely demolished so you can rebuild it on a stronger foundation. In the quiet, peaceful year that followed, I learned the true meaning of things I thought I understood. I learned that family is not about bloodlines or last names shared on a wedding certificate. It is about the people who anchor you in a storm. It's a friend like Bonnie waiting in a getaway car, a lawyer like Irene who offers a battle plan instead of just platitudes, and even strangers like Antonio and Eleanor who show you a kindness that reminds you of your own worth. I learned that justice isn't always a dramatic, courtroom victory. Sometimes, it is the slow, quiet erosion of a man built on arrogance. I heard through the grapevine that Walter lost the Beaumont account and several others, not because of anything I did, but because a person's true character is a debt that always comes due. Consequences are not an act of revenge. They are a simple, natural law. But the most profound lesson, the one that truly healed me, was about forgiveness. For months, I thought my goal should be to forgive Walter. But I realized that was never the point. The real work was forgiving myself. Forgiving the woman who ignored the red flags because she wanted to believe in a fairy tale. Forgiving her for silencing her own voice to keep the peace, for shrinking herself to fit into a world that was never meant for her. Forgiving him is a choice. Forgiving yourself is freedom. The woman Walter tried to break that night is gone, but she wasn't destroyed, she was forged. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you discovered your own strength. We heal by sharing our stories. Thank you for listening. And remember, your worth is not determined by someone else's price tag.